Whirligig by Paul Fleischman. Today, I'm going to do the last chapter, chapter 9, entitled Everybody Swing. But before I do, I'm going to read the synopsis on the back of the book. A terrible accident ends one life, but is just the beginning for another. Brent Bishop is sent on a journey of repentance, a cross-country trip building whirligigs. His wind toys are found by people in need. A Maine schoolgirl yearning for her first love. A Miami street sweeper desperate for peace and quiet. A kid in Washington who just wants to play baseball. And a San Diego teenager dealing with loss. Brent's whirligigs bring hope to others, but will they be able to heal the wounds deep inside himself? And now, chapter 9, and the final chapter. Everybody swing! Though his last name was Bishop, Brent felt like a rook, riding north on I-95, making another end-to-end chess move along the country's perimeter. He traversed the Alligator Plantation Tour and Robert E. Lee belts, then tried to sleep through Washington, Baltimore, Wilmington, Philadelphia, and Newark. The steaming streets and long skeins of graffiti magnifying his yearning for Maine. He transferred in New York at the Port Authority, the one place his father had urged him to avoid, and managed to hold on to his wallet and his life. The bus rolled past the exit for Milford, Connecticut, where he'd lived for 2 years. He looked out but didn't recognize anything, then forgot to get off in New Haven and called his grandmother. As he'd promised he would. He changed buses again in Boston, where he had an aunt and uncle and cousins, none of whom he desired to see. They were his past. The bus crossed a bridge high and arched like a silver rainbow. A sign welcomed him to Maine. Brent stared out. This was his present. He stepped off into it in Portland. It was 5 p.m. He strolled Congress Street and found his way to a bed and breakfast, the first he'd ever stayed in. He was primed to like it, but found it too similar to a small dinner party with strangers. His overly sociable hostess interviewing him about his trip with great interest and trying to get him to converse with the other guests at breakfast. The simplest questions forced him into lies. He preferred the less demanding social life of the bus and restaurants and motels. He'd have rather been out in the country as well, waking to the ocean instead of to the garbage truck below his window. He decided to move on, got a ride with one of the guests who was heading north, glimpsed a billboard for a campground on Casco Bay, and climbed out in the village of Weeksboro. A series of signs led him toward the camp, taking him past a small grocery where he stopped to replenish his food supply. He came to the town hall, then the village green, and stopped before a poplar tree, its leaves shaking and shimmering in the breeze, the ancestors of all whirligigs. Nearby stood a statue of a Civil War soldier. Brent approached as if he'd been summoned, found himself reading through the list of Weeksboro's fallen Union soldiers. The past was palpable here. a feeling that deepened when he detoured through the cemetery and found a slate headstone dated 1798. People, he noticed, had died young in the past. He thought of Leah. Many graves belonged to children. Pushing on, he passed between two white churches glaring at each other across the street, then turned left onto Bolton Road and half a mile down reached Howlett's campground. It was privately owned, a fact made obvious by the continuing parade of hand-painted signs. Welcome! Glad you found us! Cliff and Vera. Free firewood, showers and ping pong. Also free fog, rain, and mosquitoes. Park at any unoccupied site, then check in at the office. Office hours from whenever we feel like it till whenever we don't. He looked at the Prussian blue sea while he walked, half surprised it wasn't labeled with a sign. Striking out down the path to the water, he surveyed a sandy cove, then returned and passed through a grassy camping area with many free spots, but no privacy. He continued on and found a site more to his liking among the trees, with a table, a barbecue, and seclusion. He could see none of the other campers. There would be no need to hide his work, a physical and psychological luxury. He pried off his pack, dug out his tent, and strung his rope between a tree and a table leg. The tube of orange plastic hung on this, becoming triangular when he climbed inside and rolled his sleeping bag and unrolled his sleeping bag. He lay down, listening to the wind and the waves. Strange, he thought, that he kept to the coasts. Leah's mother hadn't required this. Was it because he'd come from Chicago, near the center of the country? He'd certainly fled as far as he could, turning his gaze away, out to sea. Each of his 4 vantages had been different. He inhaled the air, delightfully cool and sharp-tipped with evergreen scent. I'm in Maine, he said aloud, then confirmed this astounding fact by naming in order every city he could remember on the 4 bus trips that had brought him there, his geographical genesis. He walked to the office to check in. It was empty. The date, tide times, and weather report had been written on a chalkboard. Past issues of the Portland Press Herald lay on a table next to a sign reading, "Please, place most recent on top." Brent began to wonder if the Howletts' small universe was entirely self-service. He opened a paper to the weather page, studied the national map, then checked the details for Seattle, San Diego, and Tampa. He pictured his whirligigs in their respective weathers. He almost felt he could look out through them and see people passing and birds overhead. He moved on to the other distant scenes, postcards sent by previous campers. They were tacked to corkboard, overlapping like shingles, many with their messages facing out. He read them all, sampling other lives, hoping for a hint on where to point his own. Nearby was a shelf marked Book Exchange, another Camera Obscura, offering views of the campers' lives. Getting Organized, All for Love, The Best of Charlie Brown, Codename Attila. He was leafing through the latter when a white-bearded man in overalls strode in. "Put one in, you can take one out. Anything else I can do for you?" Brent savored this strong Maine accent. "I just came to check in. I'm in number 18, back among the spruces." Brent had thought they were pines. He made a note of this. That's a real good site for building your wrist muscles. Brent was baffled. From slapping mosquitoes. The man opened his registration book. That table there in 18 is new. The old one had more names on it than the Constitution. Went to the dump and found half a dozen perfectly good 2x8s. Just needed a few rusty nails pulled out. The Lord doth provide, and the dump's where he does it. Most folks don't realize that. Brent signed in. The man glanced around. I built half my house and all of this office from what I picked up there, right down to the doorknobs. Brent looked, but could find no sign of the room's Frankenstein-like origins. Helps keep the price down. $10 a day. How long would you be staying with us? 3 or 4 days. All summer, you mean? Brent stared. The man gave no sign of jesting. No, just a couple of days. In Maine, lad, a couple of days in July is summer, beginning to end. Brent ambled back to his camp, noticed the table's fresh coat of red paint, and vowed to be careful with his drill and saw. He felt anxious to start. He made a sandwich, decided to pick the next project while he ate, then couldn't find the Whirligig book. 3 times he checked all his pack's compartments. He'd been reading it coming into Portland. He realized he must have left it on the bus. He pictured it traveling on without him, crossing into Canada, perhaps, inspiring someone to build a string of whirligigs that Brent would never know of. He ate. Without the book, he felt abandoned. Searching for it, he'd found he was very low on hardware as well as wood. A blue jay perched nearby, raucously panhandling him. He threw it some bread, thinking of fairy tales in which generous deeds are rewarded tenfold. No mountain of building supplies appeared, but in his mind there materialized the notion of a whirligig all his own. Its plan found in no book in the world, its ingredients, his remaining scraps, and whatever he could scavenge, as the campground owner had. Surely there would be wood on the beach. He emptied his pack so as to use it as a carrier and marched toward the water. The tide was out, its wares spread on wet sand. He picked up shells, fishing line, a length of rope, but little usable wood. The air was brisk. 2 kayakers passed. He followed them enviously with his eyes and scouted the islands on the horizon. Coming to the end of the cove, he clambered up onto great slabs of granite and crossed them until he reached another beach. Here he gleefully picked through a long bargain bin of driftwood. He salvaged what he could from an old lobster trap, then discovered a pair of sand dollars, and was so intent on looking down that he didn't notice the woman seated against a rock until he'd almost tripped over her. Sorry, he said. Then he saw that she had a watercolor set and was painting a crab shell beside her. That's great, he added. Thanks. She brushed aside a long strand of gray hair and smiled up at him. I'm not sure it has the properness. What do you think? What's ness? He asked. She cleaned her brush. Well, in the case of a crab shell, it would be roughness to the touch, lightness, hollowness. Brent bent down and judged. Definitely. You think so? I'm glad. She glanced at him. Do you paint? Not really, just a little bit, sort of, he thought, of his recent efforts. Oversized eyes, drips running down the wood, and watched in wonder as she somehow ferried the crab's qualities onto paper. A sort of artist, that's me too. She was small and tanned, dressed in jeans and a moth-gnawed blue sweater. Brent thought her thick gray hair beautiful and wondered why his mother dyed hers. When I was your age, I honestly dreamed of painting world famous masterpieces. She mixed a pale orange. Now, I just paint. She did so in silence, then turned toward Brent. This morning they played some Corelli on the radio, composed in 1681. Don't you find it amazing that we're still listening to it whole centuries later? Brent wondered how long his whirligigs would last. I guess so. Amazing and rare. The dark swallows up most of us. She swirled her brush in a jar of water. Not that he could know we still play it. She gestured toward a house, tall and white as a lighthouse, out on a point. I very nearly walked outside and called, "Hello, Arcangelo? Corelli," as loud as I could across the water. Is that crazy? Have you ever wanted to do that? He liked the way she spoke to him, as to an adult. I wouldn't call it crazy. He noticed that tied to her belt loops were short strips of bright fabric. What are those for? Just for color, she said. Why not? It's so dreary so much of the year here. She looked up. What sort of art do you do? I make whirligigs. The word had come out without his permission. He wanted them back, then decided they were safe with her. Really, how unusual, and how wonderful. She studied him, grinning her green eyes bright. Perhaps you'll become their Arcangelo Corelli. He smiled in return and sat on the sand. They talked for an hour, watching the gulls drop shells onto the rocks to crack them, then went their separate ways. By the time Brent returned, his pack was as full as Santa Claus's sack. He laid his finds on the table and circled it. Ideas for whirligigs streamed through his mind like clouds in constant metamorphosis. He scrutinized, weighed, and considered his ingredients while the sun dipped behind the trees. The mosquitoes emerged. He kept them at bay with a fire, then boiled water in his pot and dumped in half a bag of noodles. He poured off the water once they were done, sliced slivers of cheese on top with his knife, and felt himself a true French chef. When the sky overhead became black, he left the woods in search of the stars. The main camping area flickered with fires. 2 children were playing badminton by lantern light. Brent walked to the cove. He turned his head up and smiled, as if stepping into a party. The faces there were familiar. He'd missed them. The past several nights had been cloudy. He noticed at once how much higher the Big and Little Dippers were. Riding north from Florida, he'd covered 20 degrees of latitude. Part of the tail of Scorpius was now hidden below the southern horizon. He wondered what new stars he'd gained to the north. He slipped the red cellophane over his flashlight, opened his book to Circumpolar Stars, and availed himself of his new view. At dawn, a barking dog woke him up. He gazed toward the east, out the tent's open end. 10 different reds quickly came and went, as if the sky were showing color samples. I like that. He studied the clouds' calligraphy, their foreign alphabet, indecipherable. Then a dam of light burst and flooded the east. The sun rose and the dawn display ended. It had all gone too quickly, like a dazzling amusement park flying past the bus window. The darkness swallows up most of us. He heard the words spoken in the painter's voice and suddenly saw his whirligig whole. He started it then and there and labored for 3.5 days on it. He played his harmonica when he felt like a break, and one day walked to the fabled town dump, returning with a small junk shop in his pack. The weather held clear. Each morning he woke to the purring of the lobster boats, and each night went to sleep with 2 years before the mast and his flashlight. After lunch, he stopped in at the office and consulted the shelf of nature guides, searching for shells he'd found or birds he'd seen and writing their names in a notebook. In this way, he knew it was a black-capped chickadee that seemed to be chattering its congratulations at the moment he finished his whirligig. He contemplated his work over lunch. It was 3 times the size of the others he'd built. The pinwheels on the front, snipped and fashioned from soda cans, stood becalmed. Likewise, the dozen propellers made from golf motive coasters, linoleum scraps, license plates, and lobster trap slats. On the blades of one 4-bladed model, he'd painted Leah's 4-part name. He considered the plywood rendition of her face. It was the most faithful of the 4 he'd made. For the first time, he'd given her a slight smile, painstakingly copied from her photograph. The head was large, giving him room to glue sea glass and red reflectors in her hair. Her skin glistened. Because it was Maine, he'd given the wood an extra coat of varnish. He'd drilled holes in shells and made her a necklace, hanging it over her head, along with a set of wind chimes he'd rescued from the dump. Maine summers, like dawn colors, were brief. Darkness and winter predominated. Leah's life had been similarly short, but his clacking, flashing, jingling memorial would give off sound and color all year, holding back the tide of death. It was a kinetic gravestone, painted in ever-blooming greens and yellows and reds. Leah would not be swallowed up. He walked to the cove. He wanted it mounted there and liked the idea that the first winds to come ashore from the Pacific, Gulf, and Atlantic would turn his whirligigs. He spent an hour hunting for a site that was far enough above high tide as well as safe from campers. There weren't any suitable trees available. He wondered if the campground owner would let him sink a pole in the ground. Then he looked across the water to the south and had a better idea. The painter's house, perched above the water on a treeless point with no high tides or falling limbs or campers to worry about. The whirligig was heavy, awkward to carry, and conspicuous in the extreme. He ignored the stairs he drew in the campground, decided it would be easier to take the road, and was the cause of much braking and head swiveling. The day was hot. His arm muscles burned. He shifted the contraption onto his head just as a breeze flowed over him, setting it ringing and spinning. It was engaged with the wind as if by a gear. Making his way up a hill, he listened to his respiration, his own wind surging in and out, and felt at one with the whirligig. The breeze picked up as he neared the woman's house, increasing the clatter and motion overhead. He spotted her weeding and supposed he must look like a demented relative of the Wright brothers. Nervously, he awaited her head's turning. "Oh, my," was all she could say at first. She got to her feet, jeans damp at the knees. Her agile eyes took in his strange cargo. Brent feasted on her smile of delight. "It's wonderful, truly." She stroked the chimes. "It makes me feel like a little child. And what painter in the Louvre would envy that power?" Brent rested it on a metal chair and watched her roam it with her eyes. A gust set it and the strips of bright fabric on her belt loops fluttering. He realized that they hadn't exchanged names. He liked the way she put important things first and left trivialities for last. He was glad he'd come. "It reminds me of those Tibetan flags that flap in the wind, sending out prayers." She flicked a propeller and admired the sea glass. "It's a one-man band for the eyes." "Bravo!" "Thanks. Actually, I was wondering if I could put it up here, if you wouldn't mind." "You don't want to keep it?" "I can't. And I made it to be here in Maine, by the coast." He stopped before he said more than he wanted to. "I'd be thrilled and honored." Her eyes sparkled. "Where do you think it ought to go?" They strolled her grounds and toured her garden, discussing sights and a dozen other topics. An hour later, Brent had removed a decrepit birdhouse from a metal pole and mounted the Whirligig in its place. "I promise you, no birds use that house," said the woman. "And when it goes to the dump, it might just be what some sculptor needs." They were drinking lemonade on the porch, both of them facing the Whirligig and the long view up the coast. Cicadas droned in the sultry air. "Now tell me, or don't, you've got a perfect right not to. Is the woman someone real?" "I noticed the name." Brent sipped. "She was." He sipped again, then held the icy glass to his cheek, partially hiding his face. "She died in a car accident in Chicago in May." The painter put her hand to her sternum. "Oh no." He was relieved they weren't facing each other. "It was my fault. I'm the one who killed her." He listened to himself as if to a stranger. "I'd been drinking, actually, at a party." The woman inhaled. "I'm so sorry." She stopped. "You must." "I was actually trying to kill myself. I killed her instead, by accident." It was like falling down the basement stairs, unexpected and unstoppable. Brent felt dizzy, unsure of where he was. He knew he hadn't let out this last fact before, not to his parents or the police or the psychologists. He felt empty inside, like a chicken from the store with its plastic bag of organs removed. He was glad the woman didn't know his name. He wanted to leave his confession, like his whirligigs, anonymously. "It's hard to know what to say," the painter murmured. She set down her drink. They both stared out to sea. "From our chats, you certainly don't strike me as a killer. Or suicidal. Just look at your artwork." The wind toyed with the chimes and turned the row of pinwheels into blurs. "Only someone with a strong life force could possibly have created that." The cicadas pulsed, then were silent. "I'm sure you know that we all get depressed. Seriously, sometimes. Most of us probably think about throwing in the towel at some point." She paused. "And, God knows, we all make mistakes. All of the above in my case. She looked at Brent. I could be wildly wrong, but my sense of you is that you're a good person, not a bad one. The words worked their way through Brent's brain. That he might in fact be like everyone else was a foreign idea, never considered. That he could have done what he'd done and still be good was an even more startling notion. He remembered the note from the motel maid. No one is alone with Jesus. Jesus forgave you no matter what you'd done, but that was his business, and the priests and the ministers. They were professional forgivers. They said, it's okay. The same way your parents said they loved you, whether they meant it or not. This, though, was different. Hearing himself forgiven freely by someone he trusted. He wasn't sure, though, that she knew enough to forgive him. He told her the story in detail. It didn't seem to change her mind. The sun lowered toward the hills. Brent declined the woman's offer of dinner. He felt talked out. Producing the camera, he took 4 pictures of the Whirligig from various angles and distances, the last one with the painter beside it. They exchanged farewells. Brent continued into town. He bought groceries, then scented food coming from the diner nearby, and decided he couldn't wait to eat until he made it back to the camp. He stepped in and took a seat in the front corner, watching the comings and goings out the window as if he were in a trance. He couldn't quite believe the world was his to enter. He felt dazed and stayed on at his table long after his meal had been cleared. Across the street, cars were parking and people walking into the town hall. He paid, drifted out, heard music, and followed the others as if under hypnosis. A pianist was pounding out chords on a stage, surrounded by a fiddler, a flautist, and a woman plucking a stand-up bass. Beside them, a gangling man was calling out steps to the 2 rows of dancers below. The music was brisk, bouncy, and infectious. Brent watched inconspicuously, leaning against the wall. Except for a few teenagers, the hall resembled a reunion of some 60s commune, with plenty of beards and ponytails in view. The caller's promptings, like an auctioneer's spiel, seemed almost to be in a foreign language. Allemande left, now ladies chain, left-hand star, back to the right, actives down and back, cast off, everybody swing. Couples turned in circles, skirts rippling. Brent stared. It was a human whirligig, set in motion by music instead of wind. He sank into a chair and watched dance after dance. Suddenly, a young woman rushed up to him. We need one more couple. She held out her hands. To his great amazement, he agreed. A few people clapped when he got to his feet. As before, the caller walked them through the dance slowly, without any music. Brent now recognized some of the steps. Knowing hands turned him left instead of right and pointed him toward the proper partner. Then the music started up at full speed, and the dancers, like clock parts, began to turn. Arms reached for his. Faces whizzed past. He was instantly enmeshed with the others. Wordlessly they corrected him, adjusted his grip, smiled at him. He'd always been gawky. This hadn't changed. But the pattern of steps, repeated over and over, slowly began to sink in. The galloping tune had an Irish feel. It was exalting to be part of the twining and twirling, and strangely thrilling to touch other hands and to feel them grasping his. He felt like a bee returning to a hive, greeted and accepted by all. He clapped with the others when the music stopped, stood outside to cool off, and was promptly asked if he wanted to do the next one. His partner called the event a contra dance. It felt to Brent like his rite of re-entry. He stayed all the way to the waltz at the end. He slept late. When he woke, he could still hear the music and see the wide smile of the woman who'd driven him back. Birds were busy in the trees around him. He looked outside. The day was clear. He lay there for half an hour. Then he realized that he'd finished Leah's mother's task. He built a fire and cooked himself some oatmeal, peering into the flames. The guilt hadn't magically vanished overnight. 4 whirligigs wouldn't accomplish that. He knew it would reside in him like the ashes after a fire, unconsumed. But something had changed. He felt oddly buoyant. He discovered as well that a new view lay before his mind's eye. He saw himself returning to Chicago and to his parents, delivering the photographs, starting at a new school in the fall. These had been beyond the horizon until now. He began readying himself to meet them. He felt that he was up to it. He put out his fire and packed his tent, then took out Leah's photo. It struck him now that the crash wasn't only something that he'd done to her. When they'd met, he was longing to be swallowed by the blackness. She'd set him in motion. Motion that he was now transferring to others. He replaced the photo and took out his bus pass. It didn't expire until August 17th. He had another 3 weeks left. He wouldn't mind seeing New Hampshire and Vermont. Then maybe camping on Lake George in New York. Someone he'd met at the dance had just come back from a canoeing trip there. He thought he might build some more whirligigs. Maybe he'd start on a lifetime project of putting one up in every state. He put on his pack and walked down to the office. He paid, then backtracked toward the cove, squinted and made out his whirligig, bright against the painter's white house. The breeze off the water ruffled his hair and made the whirligig flash in the distance. He'd interlocked some of the propeller blades so that one would pass its motion to the others. In his mind, his whirligigs were meshed the same way, parts of a single coast-to-coast creation. The world itself was a whirligig, its myriad parts invisibly linked, the hidden crankshafts and connecting rods carrying motion across the globe and over the centuries. He took off his pack. A few nights before, he'd come to the end of 2 years before the mast, the author's ship finally returning safely to Boston Harbor. He pulled out the book, felt linked with the writer and Emile and the others he'd met on the trip, and walked back inside the office. He placed it on the book exchange shelf, aware he was nudging an invisible gear forward. He wondered who would read it next. He scanned the titles and decided on The Strange Lives of Familiar Insects. Outside, a warm breeze ran its fingers through the trees. He started reading while he walked down the road. And that is the end. of Whirligig by Paul Fleischman. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you his peace. I want to say a special thank you to the Robertson family who encouraged me to finish this book. See you next time.